Alright, welcome to another episode, or should I say season, of Birdsong. I'm your host, Kayuda, and wow, it's been a little while since I've sat in front of this microphone. Probably about 2 years, and I tell you what, I wasn't sure that I'd ever be here again since the winds have changed, carried me and my life in a totally different direction for a while. But just like the cycle of the seasons and the rhythms of life have their way of coming back around, especially when there's unfinished business, here we are. Evidently, the message came through and this wasn't the end for Birdsong. Now, first things first, new website, back up, or rather up, I should say, kayudakiora.com, the rebrand. Yeah, so after going totally off the radar, incognito for a while, and then slowly transitioning back into the digital world, the call is evidently here once again to show up, and it feels right to have everything branded, or rather rebranded, under my own name. And I'll talk about that off the radar, going incognito saga in a little bit. But before we get into the thick of it, I want to offer up some ways in which you can connect with me. So you can do so via the website, kayudakiora.com. I've started being much more active on Instagram. Handle there is at Kayuda so come give me a follow. And of course, the audio and the video of this podcast will be available on all podcasting apps. I don't even know if I need to say that these days. It's pretty obvious, right? Spotify, YouTube, all the rest of it. You just search for Birdsong with Kayuda. Yeah, it'll be hard to miss. So the arc of this brief episode: a reintroduction to the podcast, where things were in season 1, why I went so incognito, and where things might be headed. How's that sound? So, Birdsong. Well, to begin with, it really feels like the version, or perhaps many aspects of myself that is, from when I initially started the podcast back in 2020. It's been 3 years since I started it. Wow. Well, it feels like many of those aspects have died and been reborn at least 10 times over. And such is the reality when you're immersed in both offering and participating in passage rites, initiatory experiences, earth-honoring ceremonies, so on and so forth. Those time contractions and expansions are like this paradox of like this slow dissolution, gradual composting into the deep, dark earth with all the leaf litter and the earthworms and the skulls and the bones. And then on the other end, this warp speed, hyperdrive, exponential evolution. So when the podcast first started, the vision was for it to be a portal that explored the many themes of shamanism, spirituality, nature awareness, nature connection, holistic health and wellness, deep ecology, traditional ceremonial practices, and of course, remembering the sacred ways and similarly related themes. And that's pretty much how the podcast went. There were a lot of expansive conversations with a lot of great minds, hearts, and souls across this realm. And, well, not to overlabor it, but to give a brief reminder, some of those guests included John Lockley, Lane Wilkin, Imelda Almqvist, Tom Barnett, Tim Lowe, Lara Charlotte, David Haskell, Michael Stewart-Arney, Beata Al-Foldi, Jiro Taylor, Leon Cossa, the list goes on. And in the grand scheme of things, there really weren't that many episodes. I mean, people are pumping out podcast episodes these days. I'm just a small fry. But hey, 36 in total to start off season 1, and it's a start. Shortly after the final episode of that season, and I didn't know it was going to be the final episode at the time, that was with my buddy Jonathan Blake Salazar, where we were talking about his apprenticeship to become an ayahuasquero. I went off the radar. Mr. Invisible, and it was needed. It was great. It certainly allowed me to gain a reorientation and reevaluation of my relationship to social media and the digital world. And, well, what's the arc of this story? The arc of this story essentially feels like it goes all the way back to the dawn of time. As some of you may know, it started with at least in the digital world, it all started with my first website, medicinepath.net, which was an online hub for a lot of my creative endeavors for almost a decade. And I was very outspoken, active, visible in regards to essentially being what I called myself back then, an ambassador or an advocate for the safe and responsible use of psychedelics and sacred medicines. And With more and more visibility, especially in this day and age, you might start attracting a few crosshairs on your back or maybe even on your forehead, a target, if you will. And eventually there were some governmente, really hard to roll that R, governmente people, the governmente, which means to control the mind control people who were, as some people might say, ultimately doing what governments do really well, which is trying to encroach on our lives in as many ways as possible, to stamp the foot on certain rights and freedoms, sovereignties, really perpetuating what has been in effect for decades, centuries, which in recent times has certainly been called something to the effect of the war on consciousness. So only allowing a very narrow and limited bandwidth of consciousness, so a selective bandwidth that fits into the socio-culturally constructed and accepted, approved narrative of our times. So some of this war or this targeting, as some of us may have experienced, has certainly included a targeting and a demonization of certain alternative, traditional, natural practices and medicines. And these governmente folk were bringing a bunch of tumult and hassle into my life. So the modern day witch hunt, as I call it, and as some others might say, it's still here in present times, just showing up in a different way. So these guys were hassling me, and with the ever-encroaching digital surveillance and censorship concerns, privacy concerns, I found myself at this crescendo of being very outspoken about, how do we say it without getting pulled from the social media world like YouTube, the Corolla plague propaganda and the jibber jabber doos, as Mr. Fred Flintstone might say. And you know, it was still the very early days of exploring what was going on for a lot of us back then. And of course, we're still exploring it now to various degrees. But I get the sense that now, myself, like many of us, we have this much more expanded awareness of the different pieces of the puzzle regarding holistic health and wellness, the healing process, what actually constitutes health, healing, wellness, illness, disease, and how a lot of our understanding about all of this has come to pass from historical times through to the present moment, and how there has been a lot of indoctrination, misinformation, propaganda, misdirection along this path of our individual and collective understanding, awareness of health and disease. So essentially this digital crescendo rose. The government were hassling me, and then whoosh, I decided to go incognito and disappear. So I removed a lot of my ties from the internet. I gave the internet a reasonably decent scrub of my digital identity, and that certainly on social media involved deleting all Facebook posts, Facebook pages, Facebook groups, deleting not only my Instagram posts, but my entire Instagram profile, which at the time had over 5,000 followers. Eventually, I made all of my YouTube videos private, unsearchable. YouTube had already done half the work there in banning, deleting, flagging a bunch of content that I had up. And then after a while of not uploading any more podcast episodes, the server that the audio files were on, well, the subscription wasn't paid, and the way that it worked was that the audio files were eventually removed or deleted. So talk about the pendulum swing, hey, from one side to the other. Extreme, perhaps so, but I also feel like that was a necessary death-dying process waiting to happen. So a release of identity, of relationship to the digital, and a calling to settle into more anonymity and time away from the digital world, especially in the face of all of these privacy concerns, the digital surveillance. And as I mentioned, it really helped me to reassess, reorient, refresh my lens of awareness to all of this stuff and my relationship to it. And also during this time, I was certainly immersed in community in the flesh. So this was through the passage rites, the initiatory experiences, the earth honoring ceremonies that I mentioned. Yeah, that aside, hey, we're back again. I'm driving my proverbial staff in the soil and claiming more digital visibility, but in a much more intentional, much more selective way. And one of these ways is through Birdsong. Birdsong, Season 2. Hey, I'm just as curious as any of you might be as to how this thing is going to evolve and take shape and how I'm going to show up for it. And a pretty clear theme for starting off the show last season was to ask guests or invite them to share about their relationship to the sacred. And I thought that offered an interesting spectrum of responses, from songs, chants, invocations, insightful reflections. And I remember that there were maybe one or two guests that even revealed that they really didn't like using the word sacred at all. But whatever the case, the intention was for the start of the show to be like opening a container, like a little ceremony of conversation. And then upon finishing the narrative arc of the conversation, it was like a closing of the ceremony or a closing of the container. And upon reflection, I think it's a nice idea to try and bring some splash of awareness of the sacred into the show. However, whether or not that'll be continued in that exact format, well, likely not, probably not. Maybe some kind of iteration of that. And it might certainly depend on the guests and the contexts of the conversation. So we'll see how we go there. In terms of guests, there's some repeat offenders certainly in the works, and of course a diverse assortment of guests that I have in mind, speaking to all the related themes of this show. And, I think one of the things in regards to this show over the past few years, with all of these deaths, rebirths, contractions, expansions, and the personal but also the collective evolutions or devolutions, depending on how you want to look at it, certainly gives a bit more insight into determining who might come on the show, because it became pretty clear that there were a few prior guests after they had already been on the show that voiced to me in public and in private that they weren't particularly pleased or approving of my vocal stance in speaking up in regards to a lot of the propaganda, the mind control indoctrination, the governmental big corporation BS that was and still is in effect, with all the media scaremongering, everything that's going on. I don't even need to say it, but I will. The Great Reset, the Eat the Bugs, experimental gene therapy, the upside down clown world saga that we are all present for in one way or another. But hey, that's not necessarily a negative thing. It's good medicine to be seen and witnessed in various capacities in regards to what we value and what it is that we feel like we truly stand for. So it feels like I'm on the topics of learnings now. What's coming to mind is that a couple of things that became apparent, or one thing that became apparent in regards to sitting here in the hot seat, it's the nature of comparisons. Yeah, so over the past decade, how many podcasts have we all listened to? Myself, I don't know, thousands. So when you're sitting in this seat and you're not just a consumer of a podcast, you're also a producer, a creator, it's certainly easy to play the comparison game. And of course, there's things like audio quality, video production, aesthetic appeal. And those things are more so a reference point of what to potentially aim for in terms of quality, like how to produce quality content. But this other side that's crept in is the actual quality of being a great podcast host, a great questioner, a great listener, having the ability to riff off the cuff, certainly by yourself, but of course with someone else on the spot. So the ability to recall information, quotes, ideas, synonyms, metaphors, analogies, so on and so forth, because it's kind of, it's the nature of the beast in this day and age, isn't it? It is this rapid fire, instant gratification, dopamine hit, give it to me now, very little time for pause and reflection, spaciousness. Yeah, it seems like that is a part of showing up in this digital world. And gee, I'm not sure I really consider myself to be very well skilled in a lot of that. And I certainly put a lot of prep time into previous episodes, and I dare say it'll be the same for the future episodes to come. And I don't suspect that's all that uncommon in the podcast world. But yeah, I find it to be a very strange thing, these digital convos in the fast-paced, give it to me now, immediate grat digital culture. And I don't reckon I've found a lot of comfort in sitting here with headphones on, having a conversation with a talking head on a screen. I feel kind of insulated in this hyper focus, narrow vision audio in my brain with the headphones in kind of scenario. It really feels alien, and perhaps importantly, void of a lot of the happenings of the natural world, which for me, and perhaps for a lot of us, whether conscious of it or not, helps to inform and give cadence and rhythm and time to think, reflect, while having a conversation with someone. And of course, there's the real energy transfers or energy transmission or exchange when you're sitting in the presence of another person rather than the digital exchange. But yeah, it's like this wide angle vision, wide angle listening, wide angle consciousness. It feels like I'm missing this when staring at a screen in this context. But hey, anyway, it's a challenge. So kudos to all those that have the gift of the gab and the ability to speak off the cuff effortlessly without fumbling over their words or forgetting where they were going with an idea or a sentence or whatever. And you may be listening or watching this thinking, what the heck am I talking about? I'm doing a pretty good job. And hey, if you think that, I appreciate that. But even now, I've got dot points and notes so I can stay on track, clear with my thoughts, because otherwise I'd need to be sitting here for a moment thinking, geez, what was it that I really wanted to talk about again? Yeah, lost that train of thought. Anyway, so that's likely what I'd be thinking if I didn't have all of these notes here. And perhaps another thing, the last thing perhaps that I'll touch on is it's becoming aware of a lot of these ideas around role and identity and showing up in a particular way for the podcast, because the digital world, it's often, you're offering more of yourself to allow some kind of energetic transmission or transference through the screen as if it's, to capture your attention. Attention is that's the money of today's day and age, isn't it? Well, it doesn't matter what age, attention is it. That's the most valuable commodity, so to speak, to use that language. But, it's like performance in a way, the digital world. You watch all these videos, perhaps podcasts as well. There's an element of performance in it. So it's like showing up in this particular way for the podcast and hyper accommodating for all of these different personalities and styles and tones and textures from different people. That's an interesting thing to pay attention to. And I can certainly slip and slide and rock and roll like a chameleon, no doubt about that. But I certainly gained a sense of the subtle and overt ways in how these attachments to roles and identity in this context was and has been detrimental to my own authentic expression and ways of relating. So yeah, after creating more spaciousness from a lot of this, I'd like to show up quite simply, more unabashedly me. And of course, I'm all for being diplomatic, open-minded, open-hearted, and trying to orchestrate and navigate difficult conversations and opinions and perspectives, with graceful curiosity. But yeah, certainly got to be mindful of like the hyper accommodating, people pleasing, avoid the sticky, provocative questions and conversations. Podcasting. Yeah, it's certainly one area, another avenue for self-reflection and growth, just like it is for a lot of people, and it was for myself in one sense, showing up and expressing your truth and being seen on social media, the digital world. Yeah, and there's a link here. Just like how passage rites and initiatory experiences, such as Vision Quest, plant medicines, just like how they can leave us exposed and raw and at the mercy of the greater elements and spirits of nature, I feel like these convos are a great place to be, well, for me to be exposed and at the mercy of my guests and at the mercy of the listeners. But hey, the call is here. I'm showing up for it. And as I say, one ear to the soil, another to the stars, another one inside. We're listening, listening for those clear spirit messages to come through. And then the choice is there on whether or not to take action. And this applies to all of us. The more tuned in we are, the more we can hear the subtle whispers and act on them accordingly, especially if those whispers, they're calling out for a change in direction, creative expression, whatever it is. Because sometimes before we know it, those whispers can turn into screams of attention, and hey, that can manifest in a bunch of dysfunctional or disorienting ways, and really bodes well for many of us in regards to our overarching health and well-being. Well, I think that's it. Yeah, listening, taking action. Here we are, Birdsong, Season 2. So if you want to see someone in particular on the podcast, reach out, give me Ahoy. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can stay in touch via my website, kyutakiora.com. Instagram handle is @kyutakiora. That'll do. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate your time and your attention. And if you're feeling it, please reach out and leave some warm words, perhaps like an offering of tobacco at the base of a mighty tree. All right, I'll leave it at that. May these musings be fruitful, like birdsong on morning wind. Until next time.